I'm just giving us everybody a minute to jump on before we get started with our guest, Kristine Lang, SDSU Horticulture Specialist, Robin Buterbaugh, SDSU Horticulture Field Specialist, and Jaelyn Whaley from Field Sheep Specialist. They're going to discuss today about mulches. This is funded through a cooperative agreement through the USDA, NRCS, and South Dakota Specialty Producers Association to promote conscientious and conservation efforts. The authors of this are views of their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the USDA or the NRCS. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you guys to mulching, which is going to be very important because I hear we're going into a dry year. Ladies, have you heard that?
Yes, I have definitely heard that. And, the drought monitor has not looked very promising. All right. Well, first and foremost, everyone, can you see my slides and not presenter view? All right. I've got a different computer setup and I'm still getting used to it. So hello, everyone. I'm the first of 3 panelists today. So my name is Kristine Lang, and I'm an assistant professor and extension consumer horticulture specialist. I am based in Brookings, but I enjoy working statewide and working with farmers and gardeners, especially folks who are passionate about growing vegetables and cut flowers. And we just wrapped up a meeting with the cut flower group. So I think it's a really important time to be thinking about mulching, and myself, Robin, and Jaelyn are going to talk about a variety of mulch materials. So we're each going to give you a little snapshot overview. We're happy to answer questions as we pass the mic, and we'll each introduce ourselves before we talk about our various topics. But the first 3 that I'm going to cover are some of our more common mulching materials, including compost, straw, and landscape fabric. So I just wanted to kind of frame this discussion. So why mulch for, your farm or your market garden? I think mulch has a variety of benefits at a variety of scales. So moisture conservation is a huge one, especially like Melissa said, as we head into what looks to be a drought year. The more we can conserve that moisture and not pay for rural water or not be putting that strain on our well, the better. There are huge benefits for reductions of weeds, which can reduce your labor in terms of needing to weed. It can also help you reduce tillage or cultivation in terms of weed management. And there's great opportunities to improve crop quality. And this can include increasing yield because you don't have competition with weeds, but this can also help improve crop quality in terms of things like minimizing rain splash. Some of our diseases that affect our vegetables and our other crops can, as water splashes on the soil and that soil gets onto the leaves or the foliage, that can spread a variety of really fun, nasty diseases. So anytime that you have a barrier that, improves that, that can be a bonus. You can also have a cleaner crop. In terms of less dirt and debris splashing up onto the crop or blowing up onto the crop, depending on your mulch materials. And a lot of people will use mulches, especially like black or white plastic mulches, to raise or lower soil temperatures. So this can be a benefit if you're growing something like a sweet potato that you need a higher temperature for. You might want to use a black or maybe even a clear plastic mulch, something like that. If you're doing things like lettuce or kale, you might consider using a white plastic mulch to actually lower that soil temperature compared to bare ground conditions. There are some cons. Of course, many of these mulches, you have to think about the source or the cost with, getting that material or purchasing it. Some of our single-use mulches, things like plastic mulch or landscape fabric, you have to think about removal, storage, disposal. So there is a bit of a waste stream. A lot of mulches aren't necessarily a one and done. You might need to top dress them every few years. So that again is a labor and a cost. And there can be some issues with nutrient tie-up. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons more in depth for my mulching materials in just a moment. As we think about moisture management, I do just want to broad, big picture. A lot of you as farmers, if you're listening to this, probably have a pretty good idea of when your crops need water. And you might be using soil moisture sensors, you might be using your own personal experiences or looking at the crop to tell when they need water. Um, but water management is affected by your soil, your crop density, your mulch, your exposure, how much wind you're getting. Is it in a high tunnel or open field? But I just wanted to call out, I thought this chart from 2017 from the University of Massachusetts was a really nice overview of, those critical periods. And it's often when the thing that we want to sell as vegetable farmers, when that thing is developing. So when the fruit is developing or the head of the broccoli or the cabbage is forming, those are really critical periods for watering. We also know with a lot of our vegetable crops where there's periods where we don't want more water. Like we absolutely do not want rainfall as the muskmelons or cantaloupe are about to ripen, because that can just cause them to go soft and mushy. And we don't want to overwater our tomatoes as we're getting ready to harvest that fruit, because we might lead, to fruit cracking, things like that. So I think mulch can be a really valuable tool in kind of helping regulate that soil moisture again and preventing some of those issues as well. And it's also important to consider like what needs mulch. Some of our crops have really deep roots, so mulching for moisture conservation might not matter as much. But you might be mulching for that weed management or that crop quality. So again, there's a lot of things to consider with, what to mulch, when to mulch, and what to mulch with. So let's talk about compost considerations. So there's a new trend, new-ish, called deep compost mulch. And this is really happening with permanent no-till vegetable production. So typically, if people are getting to permanent no-till beds, they're typically forming a raised bed with soil, and then they're covering it with a deep layer of compost. And they're usually top dressing. So they're starting out with 4 to 6 inches of compost, and then you might be adding 1 or 2 inches of compost each year after that. And the idea with this is by adding that compost on top of this bed, you can direct seed or transplant into that without any new soil disturbance. And so there's some great benefits of no-till and permanent bed systems. There's less work. You might not need as much equipment. So those are benefits. Deep compost mulch based on, I really like fell down a rabbit hole with this research study. So if you want to nerd out about deep compost mulch, I really do encourage you to pull this article using the QR code. But there was a limited number of studies that looked at deep compost mulch compared to plastic mulch, but the yields were typically neutral. It was like some for, some against, or some like it didn't matter. Deep compost mulching definitely increases yields over unmulched plots or some of our other organic materials, including straw, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The deeper the mulch, the better the weed control. There was one research study that looked at like 8 to 10 inches of compost. If I did my metric conversions correctly, I mean, you're going to snuff out all of the weeds at that point. But you're also applying a lot of compost. So that threshold again of 4 to 6, you can still prevent most weeds without maybe like totally over applying nutrients. One thing to bear in mind is what was your compost source and how was your compost handled? Because if your compost wasn't properly heated, so we're talking like 180 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, you're maybe not killing those weed seeds. And so in those cases, compost can actually become the source of weed seeds and lead to more issues and undo some of the good that you're trying to do. So sourcing good compost that has been properly turned and properly heated becomes really important. And being mindful that, is this something where you can partner with like a dairy farm or a beef operation and actually like get compost to mix with other plant-based materials and like start turning compost and making your own? Or are you going to have to source it? I mean, I know of farms that will source compost from places like Cowsmo is a brand of compost. They'll get like a whole truck of compost dumped. So, thinking about your sources and what you can do yourself or what equipment you might need to purchase to make a system like this work would be really important. Compost actually insulates the soil better than other mulch materials. And it can actually regulate the temperature better at night so that you're not having as low of a dip in temperature. Again, this was based on this research overview. So if you're trying to look for, less swings in soil temperature, which can be hard on some of our vegetable crops, especially our warm season crops, compost might have benefits as a mulch material that way. You definitely have regulation of moisture and you have nutrient inputs that you're getting from compost. Now, something to be aware of is that if compost gets really, really dry, it becomes almost hydrophobic and it can be really hard to rehydrate. And you can be watering that raised bed and the water could just be sliding off and not going into that raised bed at all. So you need to be mindful of that if you're going to use deep compost as a mulch. The research study that I looked at for this paper really talked about, over application of nitrogen is a huge concern, especially if it is a compost that hasn't been aged as much or a compost with a lot of manure in it. We've all maybe dealt with manure compost that's hot, which can actually cause a lot of damage to plants. So one of the solutions they said to this is making sure, the compost is properly handled or properly aged, or mixing in some wood products if you're starting to see the effects of like nitrogen burning on your plant material. Another issue of concern with deep compost mulch is the over application of phosphorus. And this comes from the University of Minnesota. They looked at it both from a garden and a farm perspective. But they were looking, trying to figure out, like, are we getting salt buildup in soils, especially in high tunnels, for example? And they actually found that we were, because of continuous inputs of compost, especially manure-based compost, that we are way over applying phosphorus, and that is actually leading to some issues. So something to be mindful of in terms of nutrient management, because many of our soils here in South Dakota have a lot of phosphorus in them already. So again, I'm going to kind of talk about the good and the bad for both of these options. The last couple of things I'll say about compost is be mindful of your compost source in terms of the plant material that goes into making that compost, as well as the animal manure, because there are, especially some of our broadleaf herbicides that some of those can hang on to plant material in compost sources for a long time. Some of those things can pass through an animal gut and hang out for a long time. And herbicide breakdown really is affected by the amount of sunlight hitting it, how fast the soil microbes are breaking down those products and those chemicals, and heat and moisture. And some chemicals can last 30 days and break down rather quickly. Roundup is an example of one that breaks down pretty quickly. Something like 2,4-D is an example of something that breaks down slower. So just be mindful of what your compost sources are. And if you're ever suspicious, planting things like peas or beans in a sample of that compost compared to like a potting mix or something that doesn't have compost in it, and comparing that growth can be a helpful way to see if there's something wrong with that compost before you top dress all of your beds or mulch your whole farm using compost. And there's a nice deep dive on this. Washington State talks about it, and North Carolina State also talks about, herbicide risks in compost. And last but not least, for compost, again, if it's manure-based, be mindful of your food safety considerations. This is both thinking about the Food Safety Modernization Act, and or if you're certified organic, you need to be mindful of the 90 and 120-day rule, but 120 plus days, even safer. But anything that is growing, like lettuce, anything that's touching the soil or touching that compost, it needs to be 120 days from time of application of that input, so the compost or manure, to the time of consumption. And then if it's like a tomato or a pepper or something that's off the ground where the edible portion isn't touching the soil, it can be 90 days. But again, longer is safer, and properly heated compost is always a safer bet, both in terms of managing weed seeds and managing food safety. So many of us probably grew up using some form of a straw or a hay mulch in our gardens. And this is maybe carried over to your farm. I've seen examples where folks will pull the single-use plastic mulch with a plastic mulch layer, and then they'll blow straw mulch over all of their beds, and then they don't have to do any tillage. So I think straw mulch is a great organic input. It can be a great no-till method, especially if you are filling alleyways. The photo included here is we use switchgrass mulch in all of our high tunnels at Iowa State. It worked awesome. It was particularly itchy and uncomfortable to spread. I remember being really, really miserable. And we approached it where we spread it once, and then for the subsequent planting seasons, for about 2 years after that, we would rake it to the side. We would put in fertilizer amendments, till, prep, do anything we needed to do, plant, and then put the mulch back around. So we tried to get it so that we could keep using that mulch, but still incorporate tillage. Now, inevitably, a little bit of that straw mulch did get tilled into the soil. And so we had to make sure we had an immediate source of nitrogen, aka liquid feed, to help offset any issues with nitrogen tie-up. Because when you have a high carbon source, such as a dry straw mulch or like wood chips or something like that, if that gets incorporated into your soil, soil microbes want to break that source down and try to release that carbon, but they actually need nitrogen as a food source to do that. So that is part of their energy source that they're acting on. So just something to be aware of. Straw mulch, 4 to 6 inches is usually effective, as it will settle and pack together. I do think we have an opportunity in South Dakota to access more straw mulch due to our small grain production, but I realize a lot of that is also going into bedding, and the cycle might be closed. As you consider using this on your farm, think about, like, are you going to hand spread it or grind it and blow it across a field? You'll need to be mindful of completing your bed prep or planting prior to application. And here in South Dakota, like many things, will that straw mulch blow away? Are you in a sheltered area? Or are you somewhere where it can actually like pack down and stay in place? Being mindful of allergy concerns for your crew. I think we were all itchy by the time we were done spreading like 9 high tunnels worth of mulch. But that was kind of life. We just did long sleeves and like a bandana, so we looked like bandits. Um, Straw mulch will increase yields over unmulched plots, again, from a weed management standpoint, but yields might be lower than using compost, and it tends to be neutral compared to a plastic mulch. Soils under an organic mulch, such as straw, tend to be cooler. You do have good moisture regulation. You need to be careful again of, making sure that's weed-free straw, any issues with herbicides that you might need to be concerned about. And again, if you're doing bed flips or tillage where some of that straw is getting incorporated in the soil, you are adding carbon to your soil, and you need to potentially set that off with a nitrogen source. I also just want to say, if anyone's thinking about using corn stover, I haven't really dove into the research on this, but we had multiple seasons where corn stover was used as a mulching material between plastic mulch rows for a couple of research projects. And observationally, there was just like visual nitrogen tie-up, even though it was only setting on the soil surface. So there were some concerns with corn stover. Again, I don't have like hard data to support that, but maybe something to be mindful of and dig a little deeper on. So last but not least of the things that I came to talk about is landscape fabric. So definitely a great renewable option. Now, I know some folks are like, I'm getting away from plastic on my farm entirely. Then landscape fabric isn't for you, and you can just like ignore this slide. But if folks are looking to reduce their plastic waste a little bit, landscape fabric is something that people are pretty interested in. I will say that you're typically looking for black woven landscape fabric. If you're going to get into doing this at scale, I would really encourage you to go to like a landscape or garden center wholesaler, or like a farm supply store. Like, maybe don't just buy it from like the small corner store, because you're going to get potentially a lower quality product. I honestly would encourage you, like, work with garden centers or landscapers and say, I want a 30-year woven fabric, because that stuff is tough. And also those thicker materials. One thing we noticed, this is a photo of us cauterizing some of our landscape fabric. This one was a little bit thinner, and we actually got some shrink when we cauterized, because I think this was closer to like a 5 to 10-year fabric. It just wasn't as thick and durable. And so by the time we got done burning all of our holes, we had quite a bit of shrink. You'll also want to invest in a lot of sod staples. I like a good sturdy 6-inch or 8-inch sod staple. And they honestly work better a year after they've been in the ground and they've rusted. They grab onto the soil better. So make sure you have your tetanus shot before you get into landscape fabric, and get your crew up to date. But I kind of tend to think that those reused staples that are a little rusty just hold better. You have options to cover a lot of soil. This can be great, especially if you're looking to cover, a high tunnel's worth, or an eighth of an acre, or a cut flower plot. You can cover everything, and you can just like be done with weeding. Installation can take a lot of time. Removing it can take a lot of time. If you're certified organic, you have to lift up that landscape fabric at the end of every season. You cannot leave it in the field. I am always going to recommend with landscape fabric that you cauterize it instead of cut it. So all of our pieces that we cut to length, we had 2 boards side by side with a little gap, and we would just run a blowtorch, and that was how we cut our landscape fabric. And then we had patterns with a wood pattern or template and holes of various spacings for our different crops. And we would just, again, blowtorch that and cauterize it really quickly. Because the last thing you want is lots of tendrils blowing in the wind, getting stuck in lawnmowers, tripping people, things like that. There is moisture conservation compared to bare ground conditions under landscape fabric, which some people might think, oh, it's black fabric, clearly all the water will evaporate quicker, but it does help hold in some of that moisture. And the reason I stress black woven is that weave does allow some exchange of air and gases with the soil, and it's not always instantaneous, but you do get water that can penetrate that material. I'm really hesitant to recommend like covering a whole plot with like a black silage tarp and putting holes in that and growing, because you're just not getting good air exchange, which is hard on your soil microbes, and you're not soaking up that water. Which again, I think the more water we can soak up, the better. You will sometimes see ponding on landscape fabric, but eventually it will soak and settle in. You can get excellent weed control, except for every single hole, which you might need to weed once or twice, and every single edge. So be prepared to weed eat or mow or control those edges. The yield is similar to other plastics and definitely better than unmulched. I think a big thing to think about, especially if you're removing at the end of every season, is where to store and if or how you should clean it. I hadn't thought about this, but I did come across a 2025 research study that looked at salmonella lingering on landscape fabric, and it lingered on landscape fabric more than any other mulch material in the study. So a little gross, but again, something to think about for food safety that I had not really thought about before. Microplastic concerns, research definitely indicates anytime plastic touches our soil, it's breaking down, you're adding microplastics. And I know different people on your farm, there's that consideration of what are the evils that I'm willing to accept or not accept on my farm. So I do understand that this is an environmental concern that's difficult to address. And you will get warmer soils using a black landscape fabric. So this is kind of my last slide talking about mulches specifically. But looking at different mulching materials, with black materials, you're looking at about 5 degrees compared to bare ground conditions. With clear, you're looking at 8 to 14. Now, if you are deciding to use a clear plastic, you're also going to get a flush of weeds under there. Eventually they will die, but use a little bit of caution with clear plastics. There's infrared transmissible plastics, and you can see here using white, you can actually lower that soil temperature. And this is an example of that being done in a high tunnel. So with that, I just want to leave you with a reminder that we do research on a variety of cover crop incorporation techniques and tillage reduction techniques and weed management reduction techniques for vegetable production. So feel free to check out our research on the Extension website. And don't forget to follow our newsletter. And I am happy to take questions, and we'll pay attention to the chat as we pass the mic to Robin.
All right, thank you, Kristine. I will share my slide here to get going. All right, and I'm a horticulture field specialist with SDSU Extension as well, and I have an office in Brookings and an office down in Sioux Falls. That's kind of where you can find me depending on which day of the week it is, or if I'm traveling to different places for other sorts of events. But today I want to talk about another mulch material that you may have heard some controversy about, and that is cardboard in the garden. So cardboard, is it a friend or is it a foe? So the primary application that cardboard is used for regarding mulch is usually sheet mulching. So this is a type of a no-dig, no-till method of site prep that potentially can turn waste materials such as cardboard that you would normally just throw away or put in the recycling, hopefully, as well as other materials like compost or leaves or all kinds of things that, a lot of times people will just put in their brown bin to get taken away. Well, you can turn that into a way to produce soil in a way that you don't have to till or dig. So really, it's really not rocket science. It's just layering different organic matter over top of that cardboard. So the cardboard is typically that very first layer that goes on the soil. And then you kind of, similar to compost, you'll layer your browns and your greens, your carbon and your nitrogen materials in layers, and usually top it off with straw or wood chips. And I'll go into that a little bit more in detail, but you can even layer the final layer with soil, as in this picture here. This is Charles Dowding with a no-dig garden in an allotment that is weedy. So it's a way to also mitigate weeds without having to till or spray or do that sort of thing. A couple of the early practitioner, Ruth Stout, if you're familiar with her, she is known for her no work gardening. Often people will remember her for her potato planting method, where she just puts the potatoes on the ground and then covers them up with straw and doesn't have to dig them up. So there's pros and cons with that as well, but she also was a proponent of using cardboard and sheet mulching. And then, as I mentioned, Charles Dowding as well, and many other people have talked about sheet mulching with cardboard. And you can really create any type of a garden, whether it's a vegetable garden, perennials like trees or shrubs, a food forest, native plants, and really depending on how long you have that you want to wait, you would just vary the depth of the mulch. So for example, if you wanted to use this method for a vegetable garden, you would need to put deeper layers of the mulch and then allow more time for that to break down so it's appropriate for planting. Whereas if you're doing native plants, you can do cardboard and then just wood chips, let that sit for a little while, and then maybe spread those wood chips aside, plant your transplant of your native plant, and then kind of press the wood chips back up, not quite against the stem of the plants. And this way, the cardboard is preventing those wood chips from mixing into the soil, and as Kristine mentioned, potentially tying up nitrogen. So why do you want to potentially use sheet mulch with cardboard? So it's really good if you have areas of poor soil, such as rocky, if it's clay or really compacted. So as I mentioned, it's a way that you can build your garden soil up from that base layer that might not be good for digging into or tilling or that sort of thing. You can create garden areas without disturbing the soil. So if you have a grassy area or a weedy area, you don't want to till and pull up those weed seeds from the seed bed and create more issues with weeds. They can suppress weeds that are already there and build up that soil. Of course, with any type of a mulch, it helps retain water and can moderate the soil temperature as well. So there's many of the same pros and cons that Kristine talked about are also applicable with the cardboard sheet mulching. So I'm just going to show a couple pictures here, and this is a no-till garden bed, and you certainly don't need to have a raised bed or even a defined border to use this method, kind of similar to that first picture where you could just lay the materials on the ground. But for what I did this last year at my house, I had very rocky soil. It had a bunch of landscape rocks throughout this area. It's very weedy. I had creeping bellflower is an issue, which I will also show a picture of later. So what I did here was laid the cardboard down first. So you can see that the cardboard is actually coming out from underneath the wood of that bed, and you could even spread it out further and then put your raised bed around it or on top of it so that it actually extends out further to suppress some weeds. So I did a thick layer of overlapping cardboard, and then this is a little bit of a mixture of a hugelkultur and a sheet mulching because I did add some like twigs and sticks and things like that, and then put a layer of grass clippings for my nitrogen layer and just kind of kept stacking it up. I also used some spent mushroom media in this bed as well. So that is an experiment. We'll see how that goes. But that's made of sawdust blocks, but the mushrooms have grown in it and kind of decomposed it to some degree. So that's what you're seeing in this picture on the left. And then from there, I covered that all up with garden soil, raised bed, container soil, kind of a mixture of soil there so that I could potentially plant in it right away. So it really depends on when you want to plant, what you would end with. So if you want to plant in the current season, you would need to add a pretty thick layer of soil on top. Otherwise, if you want to be preparing this bed for the following year, you can cover it with straw or the wood chips on top and then just wait for that time for all of that material to break down into basically you're just forming a sheet of compost. That's kind of what it's similar to instead of compost in a compost pile. So you're really preparing that mixture of materials that's breaking down and then you're going to plant into it. So the steps, depending on your area, you know, if it's a lawn, you would want to mow any grass or weeds in the space and definitely kind of use the lowest setting to kind of stop those in their tracks and kind of prevent them from trying to continue to grow. And then cover the entire area with overlapping pieces of the brown corrugated cardboard. And I'll kind of stress that you want it to be the brown corrugated cardboard and not any waxed cardboard or colored cardboard or anything like that, because that's where you run into some of the problems that I'll talk a little bit about coming up. As I mentioned, you want to add the alternating layers of nitrogen and carbon. Each layer should be approximately 2-inch thick. And then that final layer, you know, if you're using soil, you'd probably want it to be at least probably 4 to 6 inches thick on top if you want to plant directly into it. Otherwise, you know, you would just need to wait that time for it to break down. And then example of nitrogen would be compost, well-rotted manure, grass clippings, food scraps. For your carbon, it could be dry leaves, sawdust, or wood chips. You want to wet those layers as you work just to kind of make sure that they're getting fairly saturated, because once you have built this system up, it does take a little bit more water to fully saturate it, but then it will retain moisture in your garden beds much longer. And then allow those materials to all decompose prior to planting, especially if you're doing seeding, or else, as I mentioned, finish with a layer of soil if you want to seed or add your transplants right away. Here's another example on the left of a more minimal sheet mulching. I can say that it does take a lot of materials to do the sheet mulching that you would see on the right here. This is an image from Toby Hemingway's book, Gaia's Garden. So, you know, it shows the soil layer and you're actually needing to bring in quite a lot of material. So you can definitely do that if you have an area that has a lot of weeds, or if you want to make sure that you're building up really good soil if you have poor soil. But I will admit, usually I do a little bit less work than that. And so often I will just do a cardboard layer and then maybe straw or leaves or wood chips and then do some planting into that. So for example, this picture on the left is layers of overlapping cardboard and then really just some straw. And then I planted my pumpkins and squash and things directly into that. So let the cardboard sit a little while, then punch some holes through it, and then you can put your transplants directly into the soil. And that is just a more effective weed barrier, but you're not using quite so many materials to build up those layers especially if you've already got pretty good soil underneath. So you can also use this kind of abbreviated version if you're doing things like trees, shrubs, like this is where I would do my native plant transplants, just into the layer of cardboard and wood chips. So these couple pictures, this one on the left is just showing just the cardboard layers. I kind of keep them held down with various pots or logs or bricks or things like that while I'm getting the wood chips in, and then just putting a really thick layer of wood chips on top. And I've also done that here in this picture on the right. I had planted some shrubs, and then I'm putting the cardboard around them and then the wood chips. And for that, if you're going to be doing some additional planting, it does help to allow some time for that cardboard and wood chips to kind of break down a little bit, but you don't typically have to wait that whole like 6 to 12 months, like if you're doing this full sheet mulching where you want to transplant vegetables. Oftentimes I'll just wait, a couple weeks to a month. You could wait, just that season, and the cardboard breaks down fairly quickly, so that if you're using kind of like a hori knife or another similar tool to just kind of press or spread the wood chips aside, punch through that cardboard, and then put your transplants directly into the soil. And this is an example of that. And so this is my colleague, Sydney Trio, and we're here at McCrory Gardens planting our food forest. So this is a food forest is just kind of a main tree with supporting plants around it. So for this planting, we had a tree that was already established. We laid cardboard all around this circular area around the tree. And then put wood chips on top of that, let that sit. I'm not even sure how long we waited. I don't think it was too long. I think it was only a few weeks. And then we went ahead and kind of spread that the wood chips to the side, punched through the cardboard, added our transplants, and, put the wood chips back, but not smothering the stems of the plants. And then, the plants are in the soil, but they have the cardboard and the mulch surrounding them to really suppress a lot of the weeds. And eventually those materials will break down and provide some extra nutrients to the soil. So again, similar to the sheet mulching, just doing the cardboard wood chip method, you still kind of want to keep the grass or the weeds mowed as short as possible. For this, I always either plant my trees first, or if I'm putting this around established trees or shrubs, you just put the cardboard around the trees or shrubs. You're not punching a hole and planting into them necessarily. Place your cardboard and your wood chips down, let it decompose a little bit, depending on how patient you are, is how long you might want to wait. And so those are the two main methods of using cardboard. Now I will bring some attention to recently, I suppose in the last year, there has been a frenzy of activity and controversy on Facebook and some other websites about cardboard and potential PFAS, or those forever chemicals in cardboard. And so there's certain people who are very vehemently opposed to using cardboard for some of these potential reasons. So the recent study in poultry science is the one that got the most attention, I think. And that one was showing that, and compared, and this is in a poultry study, and it's in poultry science using cardboard litter for, or cardboard shredded for poultry litter. And so in that study, they did find that there were some PFAS contamination in that cardboard. Now, this is in Europe. It wasn't in the United States. And what they did show, or they didn't talk about like all of the different types of cardboard that was used in the litter, as opposed to just using brown corrugated cardboard. And I've seen some different reviews or critiques of not necessarily the study, but of how it is necessary, potentially used out of context for a garden application, because in chicken litter, if you're putting deep litter in, you're potentially having a lot more PFAS and volume of cardboard than if you're just using a thin layer of cardboard in the garden. And one thing I also want to add is that if you're using the brown corrugated cardboard that has been recycled, some people are concerned about the potential other cardboard, like your food grade or your wax cardboard or the colored cardboard. But really, I actually was at a workshop just on Thursday down in Sioux Falls with Millennium Recycling, and she said that occasionally they will get some of that waxed cardboard or the colored cardboard that gets through, but primarily they screen that out, and that is not necessarily a part of the recycled cardboard. And there have also been a few articles like a Snopes study, which is kind of debunking some false rumors, and a Reuters article looking into the glues and things that are used in cardboard and finding that there weren't like chemicals used in the glues. Usually they're vegetable starches or things like that. So the one thing that you want to make sure that you do is don't use printed cardboard with a lot of like colored ink on it. You want to make sure that you're, removing all of the plastic or the labels or stickers like and things like that. But otherwise, there hasn't been really any good evidence that your cardboard is full of chemicals, especially if you're using the brown corrugated cardboard. Another critic of using cardboard, Linda Chalker-Scott of the Garden Professors, has basically said, don't ever use cardboard, ever, ever, ever. And so I thought that was kind of, fairly extreme. But she had said, based on a study that she had done, that there was reduced air exchange in soil covered with cardboard. So it wasn't even the fact that there was potential chemicals, but it was just that you might not get enough airflow or water flow through the cardboard. But one thing about her study was it was just it was a greenhouse study, not an actual like in the field or in the ground study. And what I found was interesting was I found another resource citing her same study as a reason why it's okay to use cardboard, because actually the cardboard didn't really have much of a difference in diffusion compared to the bare ground. It was really only the polyethylene mulch that was the one that really prevented some of that gas diffusion. So that is one thing to think about. So one thing about her study was that it's been used both to refute cardboard and to support cardboard. So it really just kind of depends on the perspective and what you're looking at as far as like that diffusion and the amount of time it takes, because often we'll find that the cardboard layer really breaks down fairly quickly in the soil, usually within about a month or so. So you can still choose not to use cardboard in the garden if you're concerned about that. But overall, I'd say that the pros outweigh the cons of using the cardboard, as long as you're using the right type of cardboard. And there's a lot of research and extension publications supporting the use of cardboard. This is just kind of a couple screenshots. The one on the left is more of the research. I found a few different SARE grant project summaries that talked about using cardboard and sheet mulch in the garden. There's a lot of extension articles that tell you how to do it as well. And for the most part, both the research and the anecdotal kind of remarks have found that people have really good luck with it for suppressing weeds, for retaining moisture, and for really drawing in lots of different earthworms and other like soil life and mycorrhizal fungal networks. Depending on if you want vegetables or what type of crop you want to grow, you may want a little bit less of the mycorrhizal fungal networks, but that really is kind of up to what you're growing as well. So just a few things to consider. Always, as I mentioned, use the brown corrugated cardboard. The one thing is, I would say for the amount of space, this is probably mostly relevant for smaller scale gardens, for like maybe market gardens and more like defined beds, not necessarily whole fields, just because it takes a lot of material and it takes a while for it to become ready to really plant into. If you don't use the full layers that are found in the sheet mulching, you can still have issues with weeds like thistle, bindweed, creeping bellflower. Also, especially with trees and other plants, you don't want to mulch up onto the tree trunks or, really be damaging the stems of your plants with that, the wood chips. And it's really not necessarily appropriate for all soil conditions. So if you have a saturated area with clay that doesn't drain, that cardboard and those layers can create some anaerobic conditions. So that's something to be aware of. And just like with anything, not every technique is appropriate for every area. You kind of have to think about what your goal is, what your space is, what your time is, and the amount of resources that you have as far as bringing in all of that material. I'll just show a picture here. This is my sheet mulch with just cardboard around a tree. And unfortunately, just the one layer does not do very well with creeping bellflower because it seems to love the cardboard where it likes to spread all of its roots out. So here's an example of either use a lot more of the sheet mulching and wood chips or, maybe use a different method. So in summary, basically your sheet mulching with cardboard can build soil, especially if it's compact or clay. It can reduce weeding, conserves water, improves the water holding capacity in the organic matter, reduces some of that waste from going into our waste stream and can really increase some of that soil life. Here's a few references, and I can make these slides available afterwards too. And so, yeah, overall, I'd say in summary, I use cardboard still all the time, and it just kind of depends on the application. So there's definitely pros and cons with cardboard, just like with anything else. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jaelyn.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, so to be honest with you all, I can keep a sheep alive. I cannot keep any sort of plant alive. So, but part of my role, obviously, as the sheep field specialist, is to find ways for sheep producers to have some value added options or things like that. And one of the things that's really been growing in popularity, and part of the reason that I really began working closely with Kristine and Robin, is actually using wool in a gardening system. And kind of like Kristine said, I nerded out really hard on some of this stuff earlier, and had to feel like I was back in high school chemistry a little bit, but I won't put you all through that today. And so really the big question is, why does wool work as a mulch? And the biggest thing is that it's a natural nitrogen source. Wool, the individual actual, oh, I just lost my train of thought. The actual chemical bonds that make up wool fiber is largely nitrogen. And so as it breaks down in the soil, it puts that nitrogen back into the soil without having to use necessarily a fertilizer. One of the really, I guess, novel things that we're finding is how well it improves water conservation. And I'll dive really deeply into that one. And then it's a little bit more anecdotal. I haven't seen a lot of research on it, but people that are using wool in their gardens are actually seeing some weed and pest control. And so as a natural nitrogen source, research kind of varies, but on average, wool is about 9% nitrogen. And so you can definitely get fertilizers that are much higher in nitrogen than that. But what they're finding is that when we apply wool with a fertilizer at the same nitrogen level, it's very a little bit, but where they're seeing at least equal yields compared to not fertilizing at all. And so, like, for example, there's a study here recently done in Vermont that used the wool pellets, and they saw larger tomatoes. And then another study done, I mean, really, I think this wool in gardens has only been discussed within the last 5 or so years, but the research existed long before that. And they saw 33% higher yields in tomatoes and peppers. And so it provides a really good option if you are wanting to avoid having to use fertilizer, but getting some nitrogen back into your soil. It also fits really well if you are trying to switch over or if you have a certified organic operation. Plus, I think it provides lots of opportunity for you to potentially use other marketing claims as well. One of the big ones that we're using across the wool industry as a whole is that wool helps us reduce microplastics. Even from your carpet and clothing, switching from a polyester to a wool, or like Kristine talked about, switching from that garden tarp to wool helps reduce some of the plastic use as well. As I mentioned, it also helps improve water conservation. What's really cool about wool is that, oops, sorry, my picture is over my words. What's really cool about wool, and I'll show you a picture here in a second, but each of those individual fibers is coated with a layer of scales. Wool also, the animal produces lanolin naturally, so it's a very oily substance, which our first thought is, well, that's just gonna be hydrophobic. That's gonna push water away. And we utilize that when we use wool in clothing, is that yes, as initial water contact hits that wool, it will repel it. However, once that water penetrates through into the center of the fiber itself, again, those deep chemical makeups of the wool at its core are extremely attracted to water. And so wool is actually able to hold up to 30% of its weight before it actually starts to run off. And so this is where wool, in particular the wool pellets, have really been optimal for potted plants, because you can put those wool pellets in, and instead of having to worry about watering every day, you can maybe alternate some of those days. Or they've seen just water use in general reduce significantly, like for cut flower production, for example, because that wool is able to hold on to the water basically at its core and provide that water directly next to the plant's root system. So it's readily available right there. And because it's essentially locked into the wool fiber itself, there is research that has shown a decrease in both evaporation and an increase in transpiration when you mulch with wool. The other unique thing about wool is that it actually increases in temperature when it gets wet, because it's interacting with those molecules and creating an energy reaction. So it is going to slightly warm when it gets wet. And what they've seen is that it actually helps stabilize soil temperature, especially, as we get into those really cool nights here in South Dakota. Wool provides the opportunity to actually stabilize that soil temperature. As I mentioned, this is all mostly anecdotal evidence. I have not seen actual research done on this yet. But as you can see, this is a microscope picture of what a single wool fiber looks like. And every wool fiber has these scales that you can see there. And from a textile standpoint, that's what we use for felting. So those scales actually interlock, and that's how we create a felted wool product. But they also have been seen in the garden to deter slugs, because the slugs can feel that scale, and that it's essentially very uncomfortable to the slugs. So they've seen reduced slug instances in gardens. But then mulching on top with a thick layer of wool has also been seen to create a weed barrier. However, I will also, I guess, caveat that with, if you're buying raw wool or you're using your own raw wool, those sheep are out grazing. They're out in our pastures. They're picking up weeds in their wool, or weed seeds, I should say, in their wool. And so there is potential for some weed introduction. And so that's one that I think needs some more research, but it does show that it does stop any weeds that were maybe there before. And so there's really two different ways that we can utilize wool. Probably the cheaper, quicker, easier option for most people is going to be the loose wool. If you can find a sheep producer, or here in South Dakota, we have, actually we're 6th in the nation in sheep production. So there's lots of sheep in South Dakota, but we also have several wool buyers. And so there is options for getting just loose raw wool. This would be untreated, fresh off the animal. And so again, from like a food safety standpoint, we have to think about, there is a chance that there is manure in that wool. And so waiting that 120 days, just like Kristine said, is really important. Loose wool can be either incorporated into the soil. That's maybe a little bit more challenging. You're going to want to break off pieces and incorporate it. Or it can just be lay it on top. You can take that whole fleece and just lay it flat on top of your soil. The one thing that when I talk with people that have tried to use just loose wool as a top cover mulch, is that we are very windy here in South Dakota, and wool doesn't have a lot of weight. And so that's one thing to be cognizant of, is that the wind can blow your wool away. And especially until we really develop robust plants on top of that to kind of help protect the wool, that's when incorporating it into the soil or pellets might be a better option. The other thing there is that obviously our pellets have been manufactured to where they have an application suggested amount. Loose wool itself really hasn't been. It's just a matter of taking that fleece and laying it out. It's hard to say exactly how much you would need. Every sheep is going to produce a different amount of wool, and so it might be a little bit of trial and error if you can find a producer to work with. And one thing that, if you didn't check out the chat, that loose wool and wool pellets have as a benefit is that wool is actually flame resistant. I show kids all the time, you can take a piece of cotton and light it and it'll actually burn and ignite. Wool won't. And so it can be an option if you are in a high fire area to be a better fire safe option. And then if we switch over, the pellets have been growing in popularity more so than just applying a loose wool, partially because the loose wool is also just difficult to apply sometimes. But typically those pellets are incorporated into the soil. The nice thing about pellets is that they are heat treated during the pelleting process. And so that deactivates any potential weed seeds. It also kind of stomps out any potential bacteria issues that might be existing in the wool. An application there really depends on the product that you get. They all say something a little bit different, but just check out the packaging. It's typically quite a bit of pellets per cubic yard or per square foot, but just check it out per product that you look at. And probably the biggest question is usually, where can I get it? Right now, there's a lot of wool out there that is extremely low priced or completely unsellable due to just some trade barriers that we've had over the last several years. Anything that comes from the belly, or like this wool that you see here that has really high, we call that vegetable matter, that animal's obviously fed hay and it got stuck in the wool. That kind of wool is really hard for us to sell as sheep producers. And so that's where you get the opportunity to maybe work with a sheep producer and buy their low priced or what would be commercially unsaleable wool, because they're always looking for obviously a way to make their sheep operation profitable. But that could be a low price option. And then the pellet mills are growing in interest. They're still kind of few and far between, but people are starting to really experiment with them and see what they can do. Like I had someone ask me about a pellet mill here in the hills, and there's really not one that I know of close by that's willing to pellet for you, or that I know of that's selling at the moment. But that's not to say that somebody's not working on it. But if you just Google wool pellets, it's incredible the number of places that pop up. As I mentioned, we are a large sheep producing state in South Dakota. And so we do have a really robust wool market here still. And so in South Dakota specifically, we have Center of the Nation Wool in Belle Fourche that is one of the largest wool warehouses in the country. And so you can talk with them if you want. They're really going to want to sell you bulk wool. They come in like 500-pound bales. And so a different option might be actually finding an independent wool buyer that's kind of scattered across the state. Or contact me and I can hook you up with a producer in your area or help you to find a wool buyer that's maybe close to you. Like I said, I can make sheep live. I don't do so well with plants, but I'd be more than happy to connect us and find ways to make that happen. So, and then with that, I think we'll open it up to questions for all of us. Is that, and so I guess drop your questions in the Q&A, or there's been some in the chat as well. So
Looks like there is a question. The most recent question in the chat appears to be for you, Jaelyn. I think Robin and I have addressed all of the other questions.
yeah, so the question is, since whole pellets are so small and do not cover anything, is it that they work their way into the soil and help retain moisture at that point? Yes, that would be correct. Some of those are going to sit on top of the soil as you work them in, but their real benefit is deep down in the soil and being able to actually hold that soil moisture deeper into the soil.
One thing I'll mention is I have some wool pellets that I've used, and instead of incorporating it into the soil, I just kind of scattered it on the top, and I'm actually using it in my house plants. And the pellets actually expand and kind of spread, but also cover the soil and retain moisture. So it's not out in the wind, so I don't know if they would stick around, but they definitely do kind of like those little like dinosaurs that expand if you put them in the water. That's kind of what it reminded me of. Once I started watering my houseplants. And so, and they seem to like it. They did pretty well. So
yeah, and that's where sometimes those wool pellets have been compared to like perlite, to where they're actually going to open up space in the soil as well. So that's a really good point, Robin.
Robin, are you able to show your resource slide one more time real quick, like?
Yep. And I can definitely, I'll put these, I can send the PDF of this to Melissa as well. So this would be available. Can everybody see that?
Are there any other questions, or Melissa,
There was
any
one for
questions
you,
for us?
Kristine. Can they share the PDF on your gardening page?
Yeah, folks are welcome to use that locked PDF and just give credit to SDSU Extension.
That we just answered that question. It is this presentation is also being recorded by South Dakota Specialty Producers Association, and will be available on our YouTube channel within the next couple days, and you can watch it and share it as much as you like. I know I've been contacting a couple people I know that you got to watch this on YouTube in a couple days. So it's outstanding information. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And all the links that they send me will be available underneath the presentation on YouTube. So there'll be links below on our YouTube channel. So I would like to thank Kristine, Robin, and Jaelyn for their information. I learned a lot. I think it's really important to us going into this season of heat and dry that we mulch. So thank you. This presentations were funded through the cooperative agreement through the NRCS and the Dakota Association. I have to cut back on my caffeine today. And they feel free to check out SDSPA at our website, sdproducers.org. And I look forward to coming presentations in the future. And thank you, ladies.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.